The full information for the Chiori and Itto banner for the first phase of 4.5 have been released. Let us go over what the 4 stars are and whether you should consider pulling for them, or is it actually good. And to be honest, if you ask me, it may be good or bad, but mostly I would say bad depending on who you ask. So if you want to know my thoughts for both Itto and Chiori, go check out the card on the top right of this video right now, because I've already made a short video on whether you should pull for them or not. Let's move on to the 4 stars. So what we have right now is Yunjin, Gorou, and Dori, which all of them are very niche in their own way, which may not actually be good depending on who you ask. So let us start off with Yunjin. So Yunjin is a 4-star Geopolam character whose main role is to basically boost normal attack DPS or any sort of carries. And the way she works is essentially her burst allows her to add a kind of quota on how many hits where the main character or other characters have 30 hits where they will get boosted normal attack damage. This actually scales off Yunjin's concurrent defense, and that value is added right before crit. So essentially it's like a flat damage addition. So in terms of what units Yunjin is really good for, it's very niche because she is an interesting Geo character that doesn't really need to be Geo, because mostly she's used for, let's say, like a hyper Yoimiya, a meme Ayato build, and I think she's pretty decent if you have C6 with Ningguang, and I believe even the likes of Noelle. But other than that, that's not really that much characters whose main source of damage is really from their normal attacks. So depending on who you ask, I think getting 1 copy is pretty enough, but personally for myself, I would be going for C6 depending on how my luck goes. So let us go over the Constellation. So C1 decreases the cooldown of her elemental skill by 18%. If I recall correctly, her cooldown should be at about 9 seconds. It decreases it to about, let's say, 7 seconds plus. This usually doesn't actually matter because most of the time when you're running the likes of Yunjin with Ayato or Yoimiya, by the time you're done with a single rotation, her skill cooldown would already be back. So this is only really useful if you're running with the likes of like Ningguang or Noelle hyper carry, where you are allowed to actually swap to them without losing your main source of damage, just for some energy generation. So Constellation 2, after Yunjin releases her burst, all party members will gain a normal attack damage increase by 15% for 12 seconds. This is actually very good, especially for any normal attack carries, because it's not tied to having quotas, but rather it's just a buff that triggers after your burst is up. So it's a pretty nice damage buff for your normal attack carry. C3 increases 3 levels of the burst, which is also pretty nice because her burst is her main source of buffing. Constellation 4 makes it so that every time Yunjin triggers a crystallized reaction, her defense is increased by 20% for 12 seconds. And because her normal attack buffing actually scales off her defense, this means that her buffing will become even greater. Of course, that's assuming that she can trigger it, but she doesn't actually have to pick up the crystallized reaction, so this is actually pretty good. C5 adds 3 levels to the skill. It's relatively minor as her damage is essentially negligible. And last but not least, Constellation 6 makes it so that characters under the effect of the burst will have their normal attack speed increased by 12%. This is especially great if you're running it on any range characters compared to melee, because melee characters have a thing called hit lag. Essentially, every time they hit an enemy, they get paused for like a short second to give you that feel of heaviness, that weight on their attack, which means normal attack speed buffs is not actually as beneficial to melee characters. However, for range characters, they can fully take advantage of it because hit lag doesn't exactly exist for them. So if using this on the likes of Yoimiya or Yanfei or even Ningguang, they can definitely benefit from the attack speed, because that means faster attacks mean more damage. So I would say it's relatively good. But overall, I think Yunjin is kind of, I would say Yunjin is very niche for what she's able to offer, and I wouldn't really recommend pulling for her unless you're going for like a meme Ayato normal attack hyper carry, or like a Wanderer normal attack gaming, or I would say Yoimiya is probably the best unit that can take advantage of her. So for the next unit, we have Gorou. So Gorou is essentially the buffer for Geo, but he has his own fair share of caveats, such as his elemental skill not lasting long enough, his burst being decently expensive, I believe was it at the cost of 80, and his skill doesn't actually generate, I think his skill generates like the least amount of energy particles, Geo particles out of all Geo characters. So unless you're trying to go for C6, I guess you can get 1 or 2 copies, which is fine, but I highly advise going against him unless you fully intend to go all the way to get C6 for whatever Geo hyper carry characters characters that you have like Ningguang, Itto, Noelle, and potentially Chiori and Albedo, but we'll have to see how that goes. So C1 makes it so that when characters within the range of his buff deals any geo damage, the cooldown of his skill will be decreased by 2 seconds. And because his cooldown is actually 10 seconds, this means his cooldown will be reduced all the way down to 8 seconds. However, upon reading this up on Kaching Banes, this effect can only trigger every 10 seconds, which means the effect only triggers every other skill. So it's not really that great, but most of the time you're going to be using his burst anyway, so it's kind of minor consolation. So for C2, while the General's Glory is under effect, the duration will be extended by 1 second when nearby active character obtains an elemental shard from a crystallized reaction, with a maximum of 3 seconds of extension. While this may actually sound good given that his burst only lasts for 9 seconds, you have to keep in mind that if you're running Gorou, you're going to be running a mono Geo team and you don't have any sort of off-field Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo applier in that team, so this constellation is mostly useless. C3 increases the level of this skill by 3, which is kind of useful because it increases the defense buff provided by the ability. C4 makes it so that if the skill buff from Gorou it has at least like 2 to 3 Geo characters, it will heal the active character by 50% of Gorou's defense every 1.5 seconds. This is not really his biggest source of healing and you shouldn't actually try to run a healer-based Gorou. However, this is particularly helpful if you're running a mono Geo healerless team and you're going against the likes of Rifthounds with their corrosion. C5 adds 3 levels to the burst, that's basically nothing. And Constellation 6 is what people are going for. For 12 seconds after using either the skill or burst, it increases the crit damage of all Geo characters in the field based on how many Geo characters you have in the party. If you have 1, it's 10%, 2 at 20, 3 at 40%. Now this is exactly what makes Gorou useful compared to pre-C6 Gorou, because before you get C6 Gorou, you would much rather slot in other off-field DPS or other sort of buffers for your mono Geo team so that they're able to contribute more to the team's overall damage. However, with C6 Gorou, I think the damage buff from the 40% crit damage is not exactly negligible, especially if you're running a mono Geo team with the likes of Itto and Albedo or even Chiori in that team, so the damage buff should be quite decent in that sense. But overall, what I would say about Gorou is that I wouldn't exactly recommend running him, building him, or even pulling for him unless you're fully intending to get him at Constellation 6 and you want him for your Geo hyper carries like Ningguang, Itto, or Noelle. So for the next unit, Dori is rather in an interesting case because a lot of people really trash talk her. Everyone thinks that she's actually not that useful. This, I would say, holds true. She's actually quite a decent unit with Furina now. However, if you do get Constellation 6, everything completely changes. So Dori's main role is to, well, essentially kind of be like this weird healer that can trigger quite a good amount of electro particles. She can generate a good amount of electro particles on the team, and her burst does restore a bit of energy and does heal, although it only heals the active character. However, that completely changes once you get C6, so let us go look over her constellations. So Constellation 1 makes it so that her skill generates more shots. I believe I'm correct on that. C2 makes it so that if you're in combat and the active character is getting healed by the burst, it will fire an additional projectile dealing 50% of Dori's attack damage. This will be important for C6. So C3 increases the level of, I believe is that the burst? Yep, that is the burst, which is pretty nice for more healing and I believe more energy generation, although I believe it's capped to a certain point. C4 I think is one of the more useful ones. So characters who are connected to her lamp will gain buffs based on their HP and energy. So if the HP is lower than 50%, they will gain a 50% incoming healing bonus, and if their energy is less than 50%, they will gain 30% flat ER. This is particularly useful because unlike Diona and Bennett where it depends on your HP threshold, you can essentially gain both since it looks at your HP and energy, so these are two separate criteria. It is particularly useful for an on-field Dori because it does reduce her energy requirements by quite a bit. C5 increases the skill level by 3, which is I guess pretty nice if you do on-field. And of course the bread and butter to make Dori usable, or I guess fun, which I wish I had, is that when she uses her skill, she will gain an electro infusion for 3 seconds, and when her normal attack hits enemies, all nearby party member will heal HP based on Dori's maximum HP. While 3 seconds may actually seem short, I have gotten information and watched some gameplay in regards to how C6 Dori is basically the only reason why you would be able to play her, because what you're able to do is you can actually run an on-field aggravate Dori with the 4-piece Thundering Fury effect, because apparently with her constellation and abilities, she triggers aggravate so often if you run her as an on-field aggravate DPS that you're able able to actually consistently keep up her Electro Infusion from her C6. Unfortunately, I only have C3 Dori, and I'm very much tempted to pull for this banner to get everyone at C6, but I might have to see what I want to do by tomorrow. So that's it for the characters. So now let us move on to the weapon banner. So the weapon banner, we have Chiori's weapon, we have Itto's Redhorn, we have, I believe that is Ali Flash, Ali Hunter, Favonius Codex, Dragon's Bane, and the belt. So let us start off with the full info on Chiori's new weapon. So Chiori's weapon, the Uraku Misugiri, is a high crit damage, low base attack weapon, similar stat to the Redhorn Stonethresher, and the passive makes it so that normal attack damage is increased by 16%, skill damage increased by 24 at R1. If nearby active character deals geo damage, the effect will be doubled for 15 seconds, so that'll be 32% for normal attack, 48% for skill. Additionally, the wielder's defense is increased by 20%. From what I can say, based on how similar Chiori is to Albedo, I think this is going to be good if you're both an Albedo or a Chiori owner. Yeah, honestly, that's really it. I really have nothing to say. I do like the fact that it has more than just a defense buff compared to Cinnabar Spindle, and I think this might edge out on Cinnabar Spindle by quite a bit, though I don't really know how much. But I think this is quite a decent weapon if you intend to go for either Chiori or Albedo, or you have both and you just want to go for the weapon banner. So for the Redhorn Stonethresher, aka Itto's weapon, it has similar stats at 542 base attack, 88.2% crit damage at level 90, and it increases the user's defense by a certain portion. Normal and charge attack damage is increased by a portion of the character's defense. Obviously, this is Itto's best in-slot weapon, but if you are a Noelle main, this is also quite a decent weapon. Although I have seen some rankings over on Akasha where apparently Diluc can also use it. I think Redhorn is quite a good generalist weapon for Claymore characters. It's not the best, but it's definitely not the worst. So for the next weapons for the 4 stars, we have Ali Hunter, Ali Flash, Favonius Codex, Dragon's Bane, and the Bell. So I'm going to start off with the weapons that we already have. So the Bell, let's be honest, it's not that great of a weapon. There are no Claymore characters that really want a low base attack that purely scales off HP percent. And the passive might seem cool where it says taking damage generates a shield, absorbs damage up to 32% of your max HP. This lasts for 10 seconds or until broken, and the passive can only be triggered every 45 seconds. While you're protected by a shield, the character gains increased damage. While this may actually seem nice, there is no characters right now that truly scale off HP that happens to be a DPS, and the passive has too long of a cooldown, so it's not that great overall. For the next weapon, we have Dragon's Bane. So Dragon's Bane, very low base attack, very high elemental mastery. The passive is especially great for certain reaction-based characters where it increases damage against enemies affected by Hydro or Pyro by 36% at Refinement 5. So this is essentially Hu Tao's best in-slot 4-star weapon without counting the Ballad of the Fjords at Refinement 3 and Refinement 4. I think Ballad of the Fjords, you can only really get it from the Battle Pass, and it does cost you like $10 US or whatnot. So Dragon's Bane is actually quite decent. Other than that, it's of course usable on the likes of Shengling because Shengling is a great unit. You can also use it on the likes of Hyperbloom, Elemental Mastery, Raiden to bump your EM stat all the way past 1000. But other than that, it has a very niche use and only a few characters can really use it. And if you do want to use it, that most of the characters do need their burst to actually utilize. So I would say it's only really good on Hu Tao and EM Raiden, and maybe like Shengling if you have enough energy recharge. So for the next one, the Favonius Codex is actually quite decent given how much Catalyst characters we've been getting for the past few patches since patch 4.0. So basically, you know, the same of the Favonius series, high energy recharge, low base attack. If the character triggers a crit, it has a chance to generate particles, which basically generates energy. This is particularly good for the Favonius series, mostly because it generates energy particles that can be picked up by your entire team. So it's just a great support weapon if you do need energy recharge for a Catalyst character that you have, or you want to use it on a support that needs ER to use their burst, and you can trigger some crits to kind of battery the rest of your team by a little bit. So the Ali Flash is the other 4-star weapon for this time around. It has a very high base attack, but it trades off the Elemental Mastery substat being decently low. It makes it so that the character equipping this weapon will do increased damage, but if you take a single ounce of damage, you will disable this effect for 5 seconds. If you don't really have any other options for your Bennett, you can level it up all the way to 90 since it does have a whopping 620 base attack at that level, just to make your Bennett buff even stronger. But other than that, the passive, you can pretend like it doesn't exist. You don't even want to use this for the Elemental Mastery buff for Kazuha, since we do have other options like Zypher's Moonlight, we do have Tokabo, the event weapon, or even Iron Sting for the Elemental Mastery substat. But other than that, the Ali Flash is not really that great. And for the last weapon, we have the Alley Hunter. It has a very high base attack with some attack percent substat, and the passive makes it so that if the character equipping this and is in the party but they're not on field, they'll gain like a damage ramp up to a maximum of 20%. This weapon is essentially made for Fischl, especially with the release of Golden Troop being her best in-slot artifact, and I believe out of all weapon options, aside from Stringless, the Alley Hunter is easily her best in-slot 4-star weapon if you do have it, preferably at high refinements, because if I were to put this at refinement 5, you can gain up to 40% on top of the Golden Troop damage percent given by the 4-piece effect. So other than that, I mean, I'm trying to think of like other characters that can really use. Like, let's look over all the bow characters. I guess if you do use Yelan not on field, you can technically use it, but you don't actually gain anything from the bow itself, aside from the damage percent, because high base attack and attack percent is basically useless for Yelan. I guess you can kind of use it on Sara, but your Sara's not going to be off field. I would say, honestly, out of all other characters, unless you use like weirdly enough on some off-field DPS Ganyu, it's really only best in slot for Fischl, and it's only really usable on Fischl. But the plus side is that if you do get multiple refinements of it, you can actually slap it on her, and it should be better than a high refinement Stringless up to a certain point. Now, last but not least, I've been away when this whole thing happened, but apparently there's this whole new thing called the Chronicled Wish. So I've watched a video about it. So from my understanding, this is a kind of like a third banner where you can actually spend intertwined fates to pull for characters that are from an older time, and it seems like the current rewards seem to be based on the Monstadt characters. Because if we were to look at all the other character options available, we have the default standard 5 stars, and then we have Albedo, Klee, and Eula. So for those who actually want to try to get maybe C6 Eula or a single copy of Albedo, or maybe even C4 Klee for the defense shred, I would say it's pretty decent. But in terms of other weapons, if I were to look at all the other ones, so Skyward Blade, I actually do have it on my Bennett right now, and I would say it's, contrary to popular belief, I much prefer this over the likes of Aquila Favonius, because Aquila, while it has a very high base attack and does give like the maximum damage ceiling for his buff, the lack of energy recharge with that weapon really makes it so that it's quite difficult for you to really funnel your Bennett unless you really know what you're doing. And I've been running this weapon for the longest time, ever since I got it over on standard banner. And honestly, the high base attack paired with the high ER has been really helpful. It made me feel like I could play Bennett comfortably with my 200 plus ER, and he's able to basically get his burst up quite consistently. Now that I think about it, I don't really want to spend too much time going through every single weapon, so I'm just gonna really go over like what weapons I think are worth it. I think out of all weapons, Gravestone is kind of an okay generalist. Beacon of the Reed Sea might be the best option out of all the 5-star weapons that we have right now. I believe Gravestone is not that far behind from Song of Broken Pines for Eula, unless you have like R2 or R3 where the attack speed buff from Broken Pines can actually overtake the Gravestone passive. But other than that, I think Beacon and Gravestone is probably the best weapon option out of the 5-star weapons right now. The rest is kind of situationally useful depending on which characters you ask. I believe Hunter's Path is quite decent and especially good for all those Tinari owners that don't actually have his weapon yet. But other than that, I believe the 4-star characters are all the Monstadt characters, which is quite interesting because that means for someone like myself, I could potentially try to go for Lisa, Amber, and Kea to get more constellations, eventually get C6. But at the same time, I'm not really sure if I want all the other characters since I have most of them at C6 actually. So for anyone pulling for this banner, well, you must really be skipping the entire patch for this time around and somehow skipping Arakino coming up next patch in 4.6 in order for you to pull this, because keep in mind that this banner, I believe, only lasts for the first phase. So it's only going to be around for about 2 to 3 weeks-ish. So if you really want to pull for this banner, I guess you can try. But yeah, I mean, as far as I know, it's basically just a limited banner for all the characters. I don't know what Heryo plans to do with this banner. I wish it was available all year round instead of just temporarily. Maybe they'll rotate it with Liyue 5-star characters. So maybe people can try to get Tartaglia, Zhongli, Hu Tao, Xiao Genbi, even though he's running right now. But we'll have to see about that. So I think that kind of does it for this video. I don't think there's a really really anything else much for me to talk about. As tempting as the Chiori banner is for someone like me who wants to get C6 of all the 4-star characters, I think I'm gonna have to skip it. Honestly, no, I'm gonna have to put some thought about this, and I'll decide it for when the next video comes out. If I win 50-50 and get Chiori, that means I don't have any chance to get New Villette, and it also means I don't really have any chance to get Arlecchino, so I'm a low spender. I have a limited amount of pulls, so I really have to think about this closely. But for everyone else, let me know what you guys think about this freaking weapon banner. Do you guys think it's good? Will you be pulling for any of the 4-star characters? Are you pulling for Chiori or Itto? Or maybe you're pulling for the Chronicled Wish for someone like Albedo who hasn't appeared for like 3 years. Who knows? I don't know what you think, so just share with us in the comment section down below. So as usual, that marks the end of the video. Give it a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you want more content. I'll try to put out more content with a higher quality while making sure I maintain a consistent upload schedule. And other than that, I think that is it for now. Leave your comments for the thoughts that I mentioned just now, and that is it for now. This is Ethereal signing off and wishing you guys the best of luck in your future summons.